Hey everyone, Frosty here. So, today I wanted to offer an alternate view on discussion regarding Poise's mechanic, and whether or not it has a place in Dark Souls 3. I know a lot of people have been pretty upset that Poise exists in-game as a system that offers hit stun immunity, but it's simply disabled, it's turned off by From Software. Many players want this mechanic to return to the game as they feel like it'll solve the majority of the current balance problems this game faces. While I'm sympathetic to these issues of balance, I just don't think Poise coming back is the answer. My argument is simply that Poise, again, which is a system that offers immunity to stun under certain conditions, is fundamentally damaging to this game's PvP environment. I understand that there is another aspect of this game entirely, which is the PvE element, but I don't think it's wise to attempt to solve one aspect's issues while also breaking the other. Now, I feel like I need to clarify my position just to make sure that there's no confusion about what I'm saying. I'm not saying that I think the game is perfectly balanced. I'm not saying that I think the S-Stock or the Dark Sword aren't very powerful right now. I'm also not saying that heavy armor shouldn't have some tangible benefit that promotes players to actually use it. The only point I'm trying to share with this video is that if we're actually interested in finding reasonable solutions that balance this game, then stun immunity from Poise cannot be the answer. Now, I think it's appropriate to at least touch on why it seems to be the case that people want Poise to return. From what I've read on Reddit and Twitter and Stream Chat and direct questions from people, it seems to be the case that they think Poise will fix issues regarding fast weapons that promote R1 spam, namely, again, the S-Stock and the Dark Sword. There also seems to be the opinion that heavy weapons are too slow, and that hyper armor frames are either too short or too late in those weapons' attack animations, and honestly, that very well might be a perfectly valid concern and criticism. But the problem comes down to the fact that hit stun immunity simply won't fix these issues. In fact, it'll likely make things worse, and I'll explain why a little later on. There are many ways to fix balance issues within this game. However, specific issues should typically be addressed by specific solutions. If the S-Stock is too fast and doesn't consume enough stamina, or if it's got too much damage for the range that it has, then address the S-Stock specifically. Lower its damage, increase the stamina costs, deal with that weapon alone. Don't implement a system that globally affects all weapons and all attacks across the board. I rarely see anyone mention the fact that you can swing 8 consecutive times with an S-Stock at 30 endurance and a favor ring plus 0. The straight sword class is basically identical to that in most cases. And then you compare this to some of the heavier weapons in the game, where you get maybe 4 swings in the near stamina, and then you look at the damage of each of those attacks, and you start to see a disparity in balance that doesn't revolve around hit stun. Introducing a Poise system in Dark Souls 3 that functions in a similar way to Dark Souls 1 will promote a more backstab-focused style of play. Now, due to the way that Poise worked in Dark Souls 2, if you have a system that works a little more like Dark Souls 2, there won't be the same issues with backstabs, but there's going to be some pretty significant issues that we'll explore a little later on. Dark Souls 3, as it currently stands, though, allows for a timing where whiffed parries are consistently punishable with backstabs. You sprint to your opponent's shoulder, circle around, and connect with a backstab, and there's really nothing they can do about it because the backstab animation takes priority. A Poise system similar to Dark Souls 1 will basically allow this to happen much more frequently and more consistently by poising through weapon attacks into a backstab. Now, backstabs in Dark Souls 3 have changed a little. There's a slight confirmation delay, which helps players escape attempts, but the problem occurs when you combine all these different facts. Basically, weapons that have high recovery animations, or at least the same recovery animations as a parry, are going to be consistently backstabbed because we know that you can already do that with a parry. However, faster weapons with shorter recoveries become harder to punish, if not impossible to backstab. So this is going to further push the balance of power towards faster, lighter weapons to begin with. As a side note, it's a little amusing to me that we're already in a situation where punishing R1 attacks of certain heavy weapons is doable just by blocking the swing and then rotating around for a backstab. I mean, Poise is only going to exacerbate this issue. Now, one of the things you might be thinking is, well, then make a system where only lighter weapons and faster attacks can be poised through, and leave the heavy weapons and heavy attacks as something that you cannot be hit stun immune to. Firstly, if this is tied to the Poise breakpoints, this situation isn't exactly realistic, because FromSoft's going to have to overhaul pretty much all the items in the game. If
If you look at full Havels right now, I think it offers like 32 total poise, whereas if you look at light armor with the wolf ring +2, it's 40 poise.
The more important thing people need to consider, though, is that regardless of the poise breakpoints, any build which can use full poise to negate hit stun while using heavy weapons can be done more efficiently with lighter weapons, simply because light weapons weigh less. There's like no situation where a heavy weapon user with a build like that will have an advantage over the same build with a light weapon user. This is why I like the hyper armor system, because it lets you address individual weapons specifically, which is what we have right now. Secondly, if they just made it where heavy weapons can't have their stuns be resisted regardless of how much poise you have, then this will skew the balance of power towards heavy weapon users who wear poise in such an insane, extreme way. They would be able to swing carelessly without the same risk of punishment as other players who don't also use a similar setup, and the benefit of having attacks with immunity to stun becomes exclusive to those weapon types that those players are using. And we'll have more on this in just a sec. The bigger issue in general, and the one I'm most concerned about, is that poise would reward sloppy play. Hit stun immunity forgives poorly timed attacks and bad spacing, and in a lot of cases will actually reward players for these mistakes instead. In the current game, there's basically 3 scenarios for when a fast weapon user and a heavy weapon user or a slow weapon user attack at roughly the same time. We'll look at these scenarios first, how they currently exist in game, and then we'll look at them with poise. So in the first scenario, you have a fast weapon user who times their attack to land before the hyper frames initiate on a slow weapon. They're rewarded for proper timing, and they get 1 hit, and then they get a 2nd hit due to stun, and they win the trade 2 hits to none. The second scenario is a little bit different. The heavy weapon user is properly timing their attacks so that their hyper armor frames allow them to trade effectively. They'll still take a hit, but they're able to hyper through, stun, and combo into a 2nd hit. And this lets them pretty handily win the trade 2 hits to 1, and it's a reward for proper timing. The third scenario actually goes a little bit further than this. Again, the heavy weapon user swings, and they're timing their attacks, but this time they do it really, really well, and their attacks are going to land before the attack of the fast weapon. This lets them stagger the fast weapon user before they actually get to do damage, and lets them trade 2 hits to none. It's a great system to reward proper spacing and timing, and punish people who make mistakes. So, even though the slow weapon user wins 2 out of these 3 scenarios, the fact remains that scenario 1 is more likely to occur, which actually ends up balancing out these sorts of trades to some degree. Obviously, the damage of each weapon used is going to have an effect on this, but the overall concept of risk and reward seems pretty balanced. Heavy weapons used correctly can be very, very strong, but it requires proper timing to use. Most of this comes down to player skill. Prediction, proper timing of attacks, and spacing are what's going to separate the better players from the worst players. Spacing specifically is what changes up these scenarios in a pretty neat and dynamic way. It's also where most of the mid-range weapons fit into this kind of hierarchy. I'm talking about things like spears or halberds, weapons that have decent and good range. If you're properly spacing attacks such that you'll land your attack and your opponent won't land theirs, then there's another layer of consideration that makes this game more fun, at least for me. Also, lots of weapons have weapon arts that allow them to fit into this hierarchy as well. A great example would be weapons that have perseverance as a weapon art. Perseverance allows them to trade as if they were using a heavy weapon, but potentially having greater speed of attack. It makes trading effectively with them much easier, assuming the weapon art is used with proper timing. 2 weapons that immediately come to mind are the red-hilted halberd and the mace. Both are extremely powerful weapons when used effectively, and I highly suggest you check them out. Now, this whole discussion of scenarios gets kind of turned on its head if we look at them again, but this time both players are able to absorb the stuns of each opponent's weapon. Let's consider what the game might look like with a poise system similar to Dark Souls 1 or 2, where there are clear breakpoints based on gear. Our first consideration of how poise changes these scenarios will assume that both players, fast weapons and heavy weapons, are able to absorb the hit stun of the opponent's swings. Things change pretty dramatically, and it's not in a good way. I've done an animation comparison to try and show this, as we obviously can't make this happen in the game currently. But in scenario 1, the fast weapon user would normally be rewarded for timing their attack well before the hyper armor of the slow weapon. In this case, the slow weapon poises through and hits the fast weapon user. However, the fast weapon user doesn't stagger either and lands a second hit and is able to roll away before the heavy weapon user can connect with their second hit. The second scenario is basically the same thing as the first. The fast weapon user wins the trade 2 hits to 1 because the fast weapon user has a much lower recovery duration on their attacks. So as you can see, you've got the fast weapon user winning the trade 2 hits to 1 when normally it would be 2 hits to 1 for the heavy weapon user. The third scenario is actually kind of depressing. What would normally be a clear win for the heavy weapon user, in this case, ends up being a 2-for-2 hit trade in most cases, and depending on when the actual swings occur, it still might be a 2-for-1 trade for the fast weapon user. Once you introduce hit stun immunity into these scenarios, it should become pretty clear that the heavy weapon user is at a significant disadvantage. They lose the trade in all scenarios, except possibly winning scenario 3 if they can deal more damage per swing, but it's a huge step back compared to when there was no poise, because previously, the heavy weapon user would hit twice without actually taking damage. Basically now, fast weapons are king, and build diversity plummets as a result. On the other hand, if we consider these scenarios again, with the previously mentioned idea of having poise not be able to resist the stun of heavy weapons, then the heavy weapon user wins scenario 1 and 2 by doing 2 attacks compared to the fast weapon's 1. And additionally, the heavy weapon user will win scenario 3, 2 attacks to none. Basically, the heavy weapon user wins every trade in every scenario, always. They wouldn't really have to worry anymore about precisely timing their swings. Instead, they can just carelessly mash and win trades in such a way that would be amusing, were it not so depressing. And again, build diversity would be destroyed, because heavy weapons would be way too strong. More importantly though, the gameplay of the game will suffer. There would no longer be the need for such careful consideration of attack timings and spacings. There wouldn't be the same consideration of weapon matchups that existed without a poise system. You wouldn't have to make the same sort of considerations as to how your weapon matches up against the other players. I really am serious when I say that poise will break this game. I just don't see how FromSoft could implement a poise system that would function better than what we have right now. It just creates way more issues than it might solve. I don't really want to be all doom and gloom here, so I will offer up an alternative. I've said already that I have no issue with FromSoft making heavy armor more appealing or giving the poise stat real purpose. I just simply don't want it to have anything to do with stun immunity. If instead, FromSoft wants to reintroduce poise with a different function, maybe one that, doesn't affect hit stun, then that's something that could potentially be fantastic. That way, the entire subset of items that have a direct impact on poise will actually have some value in this game. I'm looking directly at you, Wolfring. A new system could be done in a way that actually encourages the use of heavy armor, so long as it gives some sort of benefit at a cost. One of the things I've thought of would be to implement poise as a mechanic that offers significant damage reduction during instability frames. This actually synergizes really well with heavy weapon builds, as it allows you to trade more effectively during your hyper armor frames. Like I said originally, I don't necessarily think the game is balanced perfectly, nor do I expect it to be, given that we're less than a month into the worldwide release of the game. All I'm saying is, please, for the love of God, don't push for hit stun immunity to return. I'm not being hyperbolic when I say that it will ruin the PvP of this game. Anyways, this went on longer than I anticipated, but hopefully this gives a much clearer insight regarding Poise as a mechanic, and hopefully I've been able to properly express the viewpoint that I and many others share on this topic. I'd love to hear your thoughts, what you guys think on the video and the discussion, so you can leave that below. You can ask me on Twitter at rbFrosty or on stream at twitch.tv/rbFrosty. If you guys made it this far into this video, I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.